Imagine it's a nice afternoon, and you've decided to go for a walk in the woods. As you head into the forest, the wind picks up and sets the trees whispering. A nearby brook babbles along, making its way over the rocks. And there's already a faint moon in the sky smiling down at you. As you pause to take it all in, maybe you find yourself thinking about how beautiful your surroundings are, how enchanting and even awe-inspiring everything seems. But what if those things surrounding you, that brook, those trees, the rocks, weren't just inanimate things for you to admire? What if, in some way, they too were conscious? Not with the kinds of complex thoughts, emotions, and awareness humans have, but with some other form of experience we can't quite fathom. This might sound strange to you, or even ridiculous, but panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of all reality, has been around for millennia. And while the scientific revolution in the West relegated it to fringe status for the past few centuries, it's been making a serious comeback among philosophers and scientists alike. But if panpsychism, or something like it, turns out to be true, what does that mean for our understanding of reality as a whole? If everything around us has at least some form of consciousness, does that change anything about how we view the world and our place in it? On this episode, we're going to talk to philosopher Philip Goff about why panpsychism is worth taking seriously, and why some scholars believe it could help solve one of science's greatest mysteries.
Maybe the external world is all a dream. Maybe I'm in the Matrix. One thing I know for certain is that I'm a conscious being with feelings and experiences, pleasure, pain, seeing color, hearing sound. That's the starting point.
And we'll also speak with theologian Joanna Leidenhag about panpsychism's deep roots across human religions and belief systems, including some you might not expect.
There's plenty of passages in the Bible where creation is depicted as mourning, as quaking with anger, as lamenting, often lamenting human sin.
I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works.
The mind, consciousness is the thing we start with. That's the thing that's most certain.
Philip Goff is a professor of philosophy at Durham University and the author of many books on panpsychism, including Galileo's Error, Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness.
Maybe the external world is all a dream. Maybe I'm in the Matrix. Maybe it's all a delusion. One thing I know for certain is that I'm a conscious being with feelings and experiences, pleasure, pain, seeing color, hearing sound. That's the starting point. Now, there's other things we want to explain. The facts of physical science, the facts of experiments, facts we know about the world more generally. But if we can account for all of that just with this starting point phenomenon of consciousness, that is a beautifully simple and elegant picture of the universe. And I think we can.
When you say consciousness, what do you mean by it?
It's a good starting point because it is a bit of an ambiguous word. But the way I use it, your consciousness is simply what it's like to be you. So some people say, it's a mystery what consciousness is. I don't quite like that way of putting it. I think nothing is more obvious and evident than the reality of our own feelings and experiences. The mystery really for me is how it fits in with what we know about the body and the brain more generally.
Philip has been thinking about consciousness for most of his life. It's a big part of why he became interested in philosophy as a young man. But when he got to university, he was hit with a big surprise. The study of consciousness wasn't really going anywhere.
When I studied philosophy in the dying embers of the 20th century, we were basically taught that there were only two options on consciousness. Either you thought it was something magical and mysterious, something outside of the body and the brain, maybe in the soul, maybe something that survives death, or you thought it was all just electrochemical signaling in the brain.
Odds are these two options sound familiar to you. And that's because they're still the most common ways of thinking about consciousness today. But according to Philip, neither theory has made much progress in proving it can reliably explain how consciousness fits into our scientific understanding of reality. Take materialism, the idea that the universe is fundamentally made up of matter, and that everything, including consciousness, can be explained by physical processes. If materialism is right, it means that our subjective experiences are the result of electrochemical signals in the brain, and that really convincing feeling we have of being conscious, it's just an illusion. But it also means that we should eventually be able to explain how those brain signals actually manage to create that illusion. And despite decades of research and huge advances in the field of neuroscience, we still don't have even the beginnings of an answer. According to Philip, that shouldn't come as a surprise, because the way we do science today, the very framework we use to study the natural world, was specifically designed to exclude consciousness.
In 1623, the father of modern science, Galileo Galilei, declared mathematics the language of the new science. He declared that from now on, what he called at the time natural philosophy, what we now call physical science, was going to have a purely mathematical vocabulary.
We may take this for granted now, but at the time, it was a huge leap. So why would Galileo make this choice?
Galileo understood quite well that we can't fully capture consciousness in mathematical terms. And that's because conscious experience involves qualities. Think about the smell of coffee or the taste of mint or the red of a sunset. Right? An equation can't capture that deep red you experience when you watch the setting sun. So this was a problem, and Galileo thought, right, we need to take consciousness and all its weird qualities outside of the scientific story. And then we can just capture everything else in mathematics. Now that was a really good move. And it produced 400 years of incredible progress and this unbelievable technology that has transformed our world. And I think we've now got to a stage where people think, oh, it's gone so well. It's going to explain everything. It's going to explain consciousness. Well, hold on, not so fast. It's gone so well precisely because it was designed to exclude consciousness. Galileo essentially gave science a more narrow focus, one which left consciousness outside of its domain of application.
Now, that doesn't mean Philip thinks science is useless for studying the mind. In fact, he acknowledges it's made real progress in mapping out how our brains work.
We can certainly do a lot. I'm not telling physicists or neuroscientists how to do their job. We can, for example, capture much of the structure of conscious experience in mathematical language. I mean, think about color experience. We can capture color experience in terms of the three elements of hue, saturation, and lightness. And we can map out a kind of color space in terms of those three dimensions. And that's all wonderful stuff. But that kind of purely quantitative information could never convey to a blind from birth neuroscientist what it's like to see red. The redness of a red experience, the qualities that fill out that rich structure. And that was really Galileo's central insight, that mathematical language is absolutely wonderful, but it can never fully articulate the sounds, the smells, the tastes, the colors that fill out the structure of our experience. It was always going to be the case that at some point we need to bring consciousness back into the scientific story.
For Philip, that time is now. Just imagine what science could unlock if it could fully account for the richness of human experience. But if we are going to bring consciousness back into the picture, the question becomes, how? For many people, both today and throughout history, the answer has been pretty intuitive. If consciousness doesn't seem to come from the body, maybe it comes from somewhere else. That's the core idea behind dualism, the other big story Philip was hearing about at university. In this view, reality is made up of two fundamentally different kinds of stuff, the material and the non-material. So for dualists, there's no mystery about how neurons firing could produce subjective experience, because consciousness isn't in the brain at all. It exists in the non-material realm, where many religious traditions would identify it as the soul. For a long time, dualism has been the most popular answer to the mystery of consciousness. It just feels like a natural way to explain the divide between body and mind. But for Philip, that explanation raises some problems of its own.
So I don't think there's any scientific or philosophical reason to say there definitely isn't a soul. However, scientists and philosophers try to respect what we call Occam's razor. This is the principle that we try to have the simplest theory we can. Why believe in things you don't have to if you can explain all the data without them? Don't believe in fairies if you don't need them. So I think, we should try to look for the simplest theory of consciousness, the simplest theory that can account for the data, the scientific data, and the data that consciousness is real. And I think there are ways of doing that don't bring in a supernatural element like a soul. And so that seems to me the more attractive option, although I'm very open-minded.
Proving the existence of something non-material, like a soul, is tricky, especially when there's no clear scientific explanation for how it would work. And when that's the case, the simpler answer is usually the better one. That's where panpsychism comes in.
So panpsychism is the view that consciousness goes all the way down to the fundamental building blocks of reality, that perhaps fundamental particles like electrons and quarks have incredibly simple forms of conscious experience, and that the very complex conscious experience of the human or animal brain is somehow built up from these simpler forms of consciousness at the basic level of reality. So it doesn't mean necessarily everything is conscious. This is a common misunderstanding. It doesn't mean tables and chairs and rocks and socks are conscious. It just means that the very simplest things that reality is made up of have some very, very simple form of experience.
How can you have experience without a brain?
It's a good question, isn't it? I mean, one point to make is that consciousness comes in all different varieties. Human consciousness is incredibly rich and complex, the result of millions of years of evolution. But the consciousness of a horse is much simpler. What it's like to be a snail, the consciousness of a snail, is simpler still. And as we move to simpler and simpler forms of life, we find simpler and simpler forms of conscious experience. Of course, in the human case, brains have a lot to do with our consciousness. But there's a hot dispute at the moment, for example, over whether plants have some kind of consciousness. We've learned so much recently about the intelligence of trees and even pea plants that we didn't previously know about. And this has opened scientists up to the idea that even plants might have some form of consciousness. And this is, I suppose, one step down the road to panpsychism. For the panpsychist, this keeps going down, right down to the basic building blocks of reality, which have their own incredibly simple forms of experience to reflect their incredibly simple nature.
So I completely can understand there are gradations as we go down. And I can even seeing it getting down to very simple forms of life. But once we enter the realm of things that most of us consider not to be alive, right? If we're talking even fundamental particles like electrons or quarks, what does it mean to have an experience in that level? Is an awareness of experience necessary?
Yeah, again, it might be worth stripping down exactly what we're meaning by consciousness. We're not meaning, contrary to how the word is often used in public discourse, we're not meaning awareness of one's own existence. That is something quite sophisticated, what we might call self-consciousness. So we're not thinking that electrons have existential angst or wondering what day it is. They don't have conceptual understanding of the world around us.
The idea of particles having consciousness, or even experiences, might sound pretty out there. But when it comes to the fundamental nature of reality, we're still a long way from having all the answers. Quantum mechanics, for instance, has posited some truly baffling phenomena, like subatomic particles behaving differently depending on whether someone's watching them or not. So while panpsychism is a long way from being a proven theory, for Philip, that's sort of beside the point. For him, the true appeal of panpsychism is that it starts in the right place, by allowing us to take consciousness seriously without contradicting what science already tells us. But just because modern science has put consciousness to the side doesn't mean everyone else has. Across cultures and centuries, there's actually a long tradition of viewing the world as alive with mind. At first glance, panpsychism might seem easy to dismiss as some fringe theory. But what if we've got it backward?
I think it is so interesting that when you live in the 21st century Western country, it does seem like a fringe position. It seems like something that we might call hippie in a slightly derogatory way. But actually, it's the position that the majority of humans have probably adopted across the majority of countries over the majority of history. So it should be the majority position if you take this kind of expanded sense of humans across time and culture.
Joanna Leidenhag is a Christian theologian and panpsychist thinker whose work brings science, philosophy, and religion into conversation.
I really think it's an almost universal human position if we take a broad enough view. Almost every human culture has contained some aspect of panpsychist thinking. Now, that doesn't mean that every human culture, religion, or wisdom tradition has said exactly the same thing. That's obviously not the case. So some of the clearest examples come from indigenous traditions across various cultures that have given particular places spiritual importance, that see spirituality and some form of agency in mountains and rivers, also perhaps in special objects that are then taken as sacred or set apart in some sense. Commonly, panpsychism has been associated with Hinduisms and Buddhisms, and these come in a whole variety of forms.
One of the most prominent is a tradition known as Advaita Vedanta.
It's an Indian tradition from the thinker Shankara that's often seen as very monistic. So there's only ultimately one reality, not just one substance, but really one being, Brahman, which is often translated into English as the God of Advaita Vedanta. But this God isn't separate from the rest of the world, like is assumed in much Abrahamic religions, but is the very being of the world, such that actually you and I and the world and the trees and the animals don't really exist separately from Brahman.
In Vedanta and several other Eastern traditions, the entire universe is understood as an expression of a single, vast field of awareness, one where all of our seemingly separate minds are actually derived from that ultimate consciousness. But not all forms of panpsychist belief imagine consciousness as flowing from the top down, so to speak. Many take the opposite view, that every little thing has a mind or spirit of its own.
Another example comes from Japan, from the Shinto tradition. Shintoism is not really, again, one thing. It's got no central authority or kind of defining school or leader, no one founder. But it's a collection of practices more than anything else, as well as beliefs that revolve around the kami, which is sometimes translated into English as either spirits or gods, right? And Shintos believe that kami is in all things. All things have a spirit or a god within them. And so this leads to various sorts of shrines and rituals, lots of offerings, and all sorts of things that we recognize as religious practices, typically in this kind of general sense of religion, that are meant to cultivate a harmony between humans and the various kami. These kami have a little bit of an anthropomorphic sense to them because some humans can become kami, but they're also not like humans because they're in trees and mountains and stars and all sorts of both man-made objects and natural objects.
These kinds of beliefs aren't unique to Asian traditions. As Joanna mentioned earlier, they're common across history and around the world. From the Sami of Scandinavia to the Yoruba of West Africa, indigenous traditions from every continent describe a world that's woven through with experience, not at all like the cold, empty universe dotted with isolated pockets of mind that many of us learned about in science class. These traditions may not always match academic definitions of panpsychism point for point, but they do overlap when it comes to this key idea. And that raises an interesting question. What would happen if we chose to see things in this way? Does having panpsychist beliefs change anything about how we are in the world?
I think panpsychism doesn't, unfortunately, answer ethical questions for us in a really straight, direct way. If you're a panpsychist, you will do X, Y, Z, and you will stop doing A, B, C, right? Unfortunately, philosophy doesn't typically work like that. What it does do is shift our overarching perception of the world and of our place in it. And that should change our behavior. Of course, one of the intractable things about humans is sometimes we act in ways that are in contrast to what we believe and what we say. But if you see particularly other living things, but also ecosystems and places as having some sort of agency or consciousness or ability to experience, that should, at least, I think, make you pause and think about how you're treating that thing, because that thing can experience being treated in different ways. So the experience might be really, really simple, but still, if there is something it's like to be polluted for the river, if there's something it's like to be chopped down as a tree, then that doesn't mean we absolutely can never chop down trees or absolutely can never pollute rivers. But it does mean that we have to think about the cost of those actions on the being or the creature that is receiving that or experiencing our behavior. And it also means that we might start to perceive more clearly ways in which we are receiving from these agents, as it were, that we start to believe and see around us. So instead of always being about the human agents and thinking, how am I affecting other experiential entities? Also thinking of yourself as more interwoven and on the receiving end of the actions, potentially, of other creatures.
Is there any indication that you know of whether holding panpsychist beliefs influences how people actually behave toward the environment?
One of the arguments in favor, a kind of pragmatic argument in favor of panpsychism, and I'm not sure if I buy it, but it goes something like this. Most of humans throughout history were panpsychists of some kind. Really, they only stopped being so around the time of the scientific and industrial revolutions. Since then, our behavior towards the planet has got exponentially worse. So perhaps we should go back to our former panpsychist beliefs, right? That's a very loose, kind of broad historical outline of an argument, a kind of pragmatic argument for panpsychism. And if I'm honest, it's obviously lacking in detail and a bit of a stretch. There are lots of factors that it's ignoring. But I think there are smaller cases that we can point to recently where panpsychist ideas and beliefs are making some difference. One change that's often pointed to is the creation of the first river as a legal person. That's the Wanganui River in New Zealand. And pollution as a result has decreased in this river. And now there are 2 more rivers with legal person status in India, and all rivers in Bangladesh have legal person status. Now, what difference that's going to make to the way people pollute a river, treat a river, fish in a river we're going to see. It's quite early days yet. But the idea that a river could have legal status in court could, in theory, I don't know if it's happened yet, sue someone that pollutes it. It has guardians, human guardians, who speak on behalf of the river and the river's interests. But the idea that we could bring more than human entities into human legal and social norms and expectations of behavior is a clear change in terms of a pragmatic change in what's happening.
It's interesting that you said this move to give a river recognition began in New Zealand. Where did the idea come from? Is it coming from Maori tradition and beliefs?
Yeah, absolutely. The iwi, or the tribe that lives in and along the Wanganui River, have been fighting for this kind of change for about 50 years before it was granted in 2017. And one of the reasons is that Western colonizers had split the river up into different parts. And the Maori peoples who lived in this river saw it as a single entity. So what I think is really interesting about this particular example of a panpsychist thinking is that it's not just about consciousness, it's also about unity. It's also about seeing the whole river from start to where it pours into the sea as a single entity, and seeing yourself as a person who lives along the river, who travels along the river, who drinks from this river as part of this single entity. So one of the arguments that the Maori were making was that by polluting the river, you are polluting us because we are the river. And we've seen that in our discussion earlier of Indian traditions and oneness and manyness. And I think it is one of the features that brings about different types of panpsychism is how it changes how we carve up the world into things that are separate from us or things that belong to us and we belong to them.
I think it's hitting on 2 really important points there. One is, for us to enlarge our moral circle, things that we care about, the first element we have to believe is that there's some experience there. But the second point I think is interesting is this idea of connection, because just evolutionarily speaking, that's where a lot of our moral sentiments come from, right? I cooperate with you. I feel your pain more because ultimately you're connected to me and I'm getting something back from it. And that sounds, rather mechanistic, but it is a way that the mind works. And to the extent that I think we begin to see things in our world that way, from the bottom up, it's going to increase the empathy we have toward them.
Right. And that's kind of what, if we think if we move into Christianity, that's exactly what St. Paul's kind of talking about when he uses the analogy of the body for the church, right? If one part of the body suffers, the whole body suffers. It's the same metaphor or way of talking about this sense to which I belong to you and you belong to me and we are somehow one or greater than our individual parts.
So that raises something I really want to talk to you about, this notion of how it fits with Christianity. I think many people, me included, would look at, mainstream monotheistic traditions like Christianity or the other Abrahamic traditions and assume that they're completely incompatible with a panpsychist view. But you argue that's not the case. Why?
I really think it's a shame and a bit of a tragedy that Christianity has set itself up against, in many ways, a more enchanted or panpsychist way of looking at God's creation. Right? There's plenty of passages in the Bible where creation is depicted as praising God. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord, or other various psalms. There's also, it's not always glory and praise. There's also plenty of depictions in prophetic and wisdom literature in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible that talks about creation and particular bits of creation as mourning, as quaking with anger, as lamenting, often lamenting human sin, and uses both language that connotes words, right? Lament, mourning, connotes some sort of agential activity, but also words that connote things that natural objects do. So plants wither, And thus withering is also the word for mourning. And oceans roar, which already we can hear that has a kind of vocal element like a lion, but also just the making of the noise of the ocean waves. So I think there are passages in the Jewish scriptures that have a very enchanted or experiential attitude towards the natural world, that give the natural world itself agency, experience, and subjectivity. And these are then picked up in the New Testament too, right? So Jesus says that if you don't praise, the very rocks will cry out. And in Romans 8, the creation groans as it waits for the freedom of the children of God. So it's easy to try and dismiss these as what we might think of as mere metaphors. But also, why can't it be poetic language that points to something real, something that's going on in creation and in nature that we don't have words for except anthropomorphic words, but there's still something there, something experiencing, something praising, something mourning in some way that our language can't quite grasp.
As you were saying that, and I thought about my early life as a Catholic, reading these and hearing these passages, that's exactly what I would have said. Oh, that's just nice poetic language. But I understand the argument you're making. But if we conceive of it that way, if we think of creation calling out or praising or rocks having some type of experience in relation to the divine, does that change anything about how we here, meaning Christians, think about our place in the world and our responsibilities to it?
I think it has to. I think it has to give a sense of salvation as bigger than just humans getting stuff wrong and needing rescue. A sense of the whole world has gone wrong and needs rescue and will be remade to praise God. So I think the first thing it does for me is expand the Christian hope, expand the scope of salvation, and leads to, I think, an increased sense of awe at what, as Christians, we claim Jesus has done, which isn't just to save me and you, but to save everything. And I think that should change the way that Christians interact with the wider creation around them as part of the church, as part of the gospel, not something that's just irrelevant to Christianity, and to view that humanity's role is still undeniably central. Jesus became a human and didn't become a turtle or a dog or a lion or a tree. Humans are, in one sense, the protagonists of the story, other than God's the protagonist, but we're not the only characters. I think that would be the way the shift of the Christian story would change on a panpsychist picture, when we start thinking, okay, these biblical passages might be metaphors and poetic, but metaphors for what? Poetry for what? Pointing at what? Something real.
Do you think adopting a panpsychist view can help Christians do something else? That is, do you think it provides a way to reconcile faith with modern science, particularly when it comes to some of those most intractable questions, the nature of the soul or creation or divine action?
I have big hopes that panpsychism can be a unifying philosophy for a bunch of otherwise seemingly incompatible positions, insofar as it's compatible and amenable to scientific exploration. There are some scientists increasingly interested in it, and it's clearly this deeply spiritual and enchanted view of the world. It can bring spirituality and science together. But I also think there's another really exciting kind of dialogue bringing together that panpsychism can do, because sometimes Christianity and science unify forces against animistic and indigenous peoples, right? So panpsychism could also be, I think, a really helpful metaphysical shared position that means that we can listen better to each other and stop disregarding other people's philosophies and worldview as so outrageous that they're not even worth listening to or talking with. I think if we all shared a basic panpsychism, a lot of the historic fights that mean that we just don't listen well and we see each other as ridiculous would go away. And so I'd say pretty high hopes for the potential of panpsychism in bridging and creating dialogue.
This sense of hope is something Joanna shares with Philip. In their view, panpsychism isn't just a tool for bringing different worldviews into conversation. It also offers a way to re-enchant the world without getting rid of science.
As scientists and philosophers, our starting point shouldn't be what would we like to be true, but what is most likely to be true. I mean, the great thing about panpsychism is that I think there's a really good case for its probable truth, but it also is maybe a little bit better for our mental and spiritual health. On panpsychism, we are conscious creatures in a conscious universe. And it does resonate with many of the spiritual traditions of the world. So, yeah, it's the best of both worlds. It's probably true, and it's quite nice as well.
For Philip, that combination turned out to be more than just philosophically satisfying. After many years as an atheist, it helped him open the door back to spirituality, and eventually to a new way of seeing his own Christian roots.
Well, one thing that drew me back to Christianity was learning about the mystical traditions that are there in all the Abrahamic faiths. You know, we have Sufism in Islam, we have Kabbalah in Judaism, and we have many great mystics in Christianity too. In the Eastern Church, for example, there's much less emphasis on sin. In the Eastern Church, God isn't interested in finding someone to punish for our sins. God's desire is to become one with humanity, become one with the entire physical universe. So this was a way of thinking about Christianity that I heard nothing about actually in my particular religious upbringing, but it's one that really deeply resonates with me, and I think does fit quite well with a panpsychist picture of the universe. It's hard to imagine the divine pervading the universe if the universe is just a kind of impersonal mechanism or mostly empty space. But if the universe is itself pervaded by consciousness, then it's a lot more intelligible that the divine might pervade this thing that is already filled with consciousness.
Are panpsychists right? We don't have any way of knowing, at least not yet. But to me, the resurgence of this ancient idea is important, not just because it might help us explain how consciousness emerges, but because, even if it's wrong, it will surely help us ask better questions. And if it can also help us feel more connected to each other and the world we share, maybe that's reason enough to take it seriously. Coming soon on How God Works, it's been clear for a while that American men are experiencing what can only be called a crisis. When it comes to the usual markers of success, education, employment, finances, they're falling behind where they used to be. And the result isn't only a problem for earning a living, it's turning into a crisis of meaning and despair. So over the past few months, we've been hard at work on a special episode to explore not only what led to this crisis, but what role religion and spirituality can play in helping men through it. But while we put the finishing touches on that episode, we're going to share another favorite from our archives, one that is more relevant now than ever. The struggle of that in-between time, where you're not quite a kid and not quite an adult. A time that feels both expanded and compressed in our social media tech-filled world. Adolescence is messy, confusing in all ways, which is why religions have created rituals to aid that transition. Rituals that help adolescents move into becoming competent adults. So next time on How God Works, we'll take a look at some of these rites of passage and how they're uniquely adapted to the adolescent brain. How God Works is hosted by me, Dave DeSteno. This episode was written by Sophie Eisenberg and me. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman. Our producer is Sophie Eisenberg, and our associate producer is Emmanuel Desarme. Genevieve Sponsler is our executive producer. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, arranged by Chloe DeSteno. Additional music this episode from Josie Holtzman and Blue Dot Sessions. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. To find out more about the show, go to howgodworks, all one word, .org. You can also follow us on Instagram at howgodworkspod, or me on X or Blue Sky at David DeSteno.